There's a version of intelligence that works against you in almost every room you walk into. And the smarter you are, the harder it is to see. It looks like thoroughness, like being a good communicator, like making sure people have everything they need to understand you. But the people in the room aren't registering thoroughness. They're registering something else entirely, and it changes how much they trust you. If you've ever finished explaining yourself and felt worse than before you started, you've already felt the cost. The explanation made things worse, and you couldn't figure out why, because the problem isn't what you're saying. It's what the act of saying it reveals, about where the need to explain is actually coming from. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the pattern started, what it signals to the people around you, and the one distinction that changes how you show up in every room that matters. Over-explaining isn't a communication habit. It's a protection strategy, one your nervous system runs automatically, usually before you're consciously aware you're doing it. Pete Walker, a trauma therapist who spent decades working with people recovering from difficult early environments, identified what he called the fawn response, a fourth survival strategy alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Most people understand the first three. Fight mobilizes aggression to neutralize the threat. Flight uses distance to get away from it. Freeze shuts the system down entirely when neither of those is possible. But there's a fourth response that gets far less attention, and it's the one most intelligent people default to. Fawn manages threat through appeasement, through talking, through explaining, through preemptively answering the question that hasn't been asked yet, to stay ahead of the reaction that might be coming. What makes fawn different is the environment that produces it. Fight and flight develop in situations where action is an option. Fawn develops in situations where action would make things worse, where the threat is emotional rather than physical, and where the person who might hurt you is also the person you need. You couldn't fight, you couldn't leave, so you learn to manage. Picture this. You make a decision, something small, and before anyone has said a word, you're already 3 sentences into why you made it. Not because you were asked, because somewhere inside you there's a calculation running. If I explain this well enough, there's less chance of conflict, less chance of disapproval, less chance of something going wrong. You catch yourself mid-sentence sometimes and wonder why you're still talking. The point was made 2 paragraphs ago. The intelligent part of you is doing what it always does. Analyzing, anticipating, optimizing. The problem is that it's applying that logic to a situation that doesn't need solving. Nobody asked for the explanation. The need to give one came from somewhere else entirely. And here's what almost nobody who over-explains has ever been told directly. What you're communicating, what the person on the receiving end actually registers, is almost never what you intended. We'll come back to that. But first, you need to understand where the pattern came from, because it didn't start in this room. The over-explaining pattern is almost always learned, in an environment where approval wasn't given freely. It had to be earned. In attachment theory, developed by Bowlby and expanded through decades of research, one pattern that forms early in life is anxious attachment. It develops when emotional safety is conditional, not necessarily in harsh environments, often in environments that were simply unpredictable. A parent who was sometimes warm and sometimes withdrawn, with no clear signal for which you'd get. A household where the right explanation could diffuse tension, but no explanation or the wrong one made things worse. Every child runs the same experiment. They test what makes the environment stable. And in environments like that, children often discover that explaining works, that getting ahead of the reaction, managing the other person's interpretation, gives them some control over something that otherwise felt completely outside their hands. And here's what's worth understanding about intelligence in that context. Smarter children don't just learn to explain, they learn to anticipate. They read the emotional temperature of the room before they've said a word. They identify the most likely objection and address it in advance. They develop a level of social sensitivity that looks from the outside like emotional maturity. And in many ways it is. But underneath it is a nervous system that learned early. That attention to other people's reactions was a survival skill, not a preference. You didn't decide to become this. You practiced the response hundreds of times in an environment that confirmed it each time, until it became the automatic first move. Whenever you sensed any possibility of disapproval from anyone about anything, not just from the original authority figures, the nervous system generalizes. Once it learns that explaining works with one person, it applies the strategy everywhere. To bosses, to partners, to strangers in a conversation you'll never have again. But here's what most people don't expect. The smarter you are, the more sophisticated the over-explaining becomes. And the more sophisticated it becomes, the harder it is to see for what it is, because it starts to look exactly like competence. Your explanations are thorough, organized, and often entirely reasonable, which is precisely what makes them so difficult to recognize as a fear response. You got remarkably good at protecting yourself in a way that looks like communication, and nobody, including you, ever had reason to question it, because the output was always so reasonable. The cost of not understanding this isn't abstract. It shows up in exactly the moments where you most want to be taken seriously, the conversations where your credibility matters, where trust is being formed, where the other person is deciding how much weight to give you. Those are precisely the moments the pattern undermines you most. Over-explaining communicates the opposite of what you intend. You mean to signal competence and good faith. What it actually signals is doubt. Specifically, doubt about whether you're allowed to take up the space you're in. John Gottman's research on relationship dynamics identified defensiveness, which is what over-explaining most often is, as one of 4 behaviors that consistently predicts breakdown. What makes it corrosive isn't that it signals aggression, it's that it signals insecurity. The person who keeps explaining is seeking permission, and seeking permission changes how others see you, in ways that are very difficult to reverse once they've formed. Think about what this looks like in a room that matters. You've made a decision, a good one you stand behind, and before anyone has pushed back, you've already defended it 3 times. Every additional sentence after the first defense registers to the people in the room the same way. This person doesn't believe their own position, and once that registers, it's very hard to undo with more explaining. More explaining just confirms it. The people you trust most, the ones whose judgment you respect without question, almost certainly don't explain themselves constantly. They state their position. They're open to questions. But there's no scramble, no running ahead of the objection before it's raised. Their confidence comes through in what they don't feel the need to say. You're not over-explaining because you're weak. You're over-explaining because you're perceptive. And your perception reads every room for potential disapproval before you've consciously registered it. The problem is that perception without regulation looks to everyone watching like anxiety about your own right to be there. The shift isn't to stop explaining. It's to notice the difference between explaining for connection, giving someone information that genuinely helps them understand, and explaining for safety, pre-answering objections to make yourself feel less exposed. One comes from confidence. The other comes from the part of you that still believes. The explanation is the only thing standing between you and disapproval. You can learn to feel the difference. It has a specific quality. The urge to explain for safety carries a tightness to it, a sense that something bad will happen if you don't fill the silence. Explaining for connection doesn't feel like that. It feels like generosity, what you learned in an environment that made your safety conditional on your performance, what your nervous system is still running in rooms that no longer ask for it, and the gap between what you're actually communicating and what the people in those rooms are registering, not because they misunderstand you, but because the signal the pattern sends is very different from the signal you intend. The distance between who you are and what the over-explaining makes you look like is the thing worth sitting with. Because the person underneath the pattern is usually exactly as capable as they've been trying to prove. They just never needed to prove it in the first place. The next time you feel the urge to keep talking after the point has been made, ask yourself one question. Am I explaining because they need to understand, or because I need to feel safe? Those 2 things feel identical from the inside. They look completely different from the outside. Tell me, what's the situation where you most notice yourself over-explaining? I read everyone,